It's wonderful to be with you, and I know, because I spoke to your bishop last evening, and he is very saddened that he wasn't able to be with you today. But I know that today, as he rests, and he is keeping you all of us in prayer, and I have great respect for your bishop, and I miss him here as well, and hope that you will continue to keep him in prayer as he is restored and renewed. I'm going to start the discussion, at least on the panel, and in terms of how we got here. One of the things that you need to know about my role on the commission was a little different than Scott's and Tom's. I was one of the 3 moderators. As a moderator, my job was not to participate in the discussions that the commission had. I was part, as a moderator, I was part of setting the stage. I was part of the prayer and worship. I was part of the design in how we get this very diverse group to sit down and talk with one another and not talk at one another or talk past one another. And part of my job was to keep people at the table when discussions got a little warm. And so that's part of what I did, and I took that particular job seriously. And sometimes I had to remind my other 2 moderators that their job was not to participate in the discussion. How we got here: General Conference 2016 asked the Council of Bishops to create a commission that would look at our inclusion question of the LGBTQ community. Now, why did they do that? Well, since 1972, we came one general conference after another with a question about how we treat inclusion of homosexual persons. It was in 1972 that incompatibility with Christian teaching, that language was added to the discipline. It was actually added from the floor of the discipline. Somebody came from the floor and wanted to add that into the discipline after a discussion. You remember 1972, it wasn't that far away from when we became the United Methodist Church in 1968, that recommendation or that motion off the floor actually came after a discussion of what the new social principles of the denomination would be. So this was the language added there, then started a series of discussions that would continue for every general conference since that time. And every general conference since that time revved up the hearts of war. At each successive general conference, we came to, the delegates came to that with a higher level of really preparing for war. You heard it in the language. Any of you who have been to general conference or talked to a general conference delegate, we talked like, well, God, we've got to gird up. We've got to put on our armor. We've just got to be ready. We've got to have our position. We've got to. It became in 2016 that negative, that warlike mindset hit a pitch where people were having actually physical symptoms. We had legislative groups where people were having heart issues, where ambulances had to be called. The stress had gotten so high and the tension so high that the 2016 General Conference said, we got to stop this. I mean, please help us. And that's what happened actually on the floor of General Conference in 2016. The General Conference said, help us. We're killing ourselves here, really. We need some help with this, and that's when a motion was made from the floor requesting that the bishops put together a commission that would look at the issue of the inclusion of the homosexual community, the LGBTQ community, and how we would move forward as a church. The commission's work, the commission was a very diverse group, as you all know. It was a group that was representative of around the world, 32 persons, 9 nations, all jurisdictions, men, women, straight, gay, laity, clergy, deacons, bishops, elders, young adults. It was just one of the most diverse groups that we'd ever put together. And this was a new way for the General Conference to work. Actually, this is a new way for the United Methodist Church to work. Usually, if there's a question, a concern, a challenge out there, the church's answer to that is to get a group of like-minded people together who have a passion around that particular issue and let that group of like-minded people figure it out. Why? Because that's the easiest and straightest, fastest way to get it done. However, the easiest way is not always the best way. So we brought together a group of people that were not like-minded, far from it. And so we did use the resource, the Anatomy of Peace, to help this group develop, listen to people's stories, get past their positions and begin to talk about the interests underneath, the interests that they all were passionate about the church. They all loved Christ. They wanted to find a way forward. And so the commission was formed out of that work and tried to work from a heart of peace. The commission, part of how we've gotten to this place is the commission always understood its role and relationship as to report to the Council of Bishops and have a dialogue with the Council of Bishops. It was the Council of Bishops who created the commission. That's how you got on. That's how you became a part of this, is that there was a bishop who lifted your name. So the commission always understood its role in relation to the Council of Bishops, and that it would actually be the Council of Bishops who would bring the report to the General Conference. So, with that understanding, the commission had frequent conversations back and forth with the Council of Bishops. The commission would do some work, and it would be shared with the Council of Bishops. The Council of Bishops, if you didn't know, actually scheduled extra meetings this past year to hear reports and to work solely on reflecting back some things with the commission as it did its work. As you know, when the commission got to what it thought it was its final report to the Council of Bishops made a recommendation out of the work of the commission for the one plan, the one church plan. And you got that reported out. Then there was a referral, there was a judicial council decision. One of the things that came up is when the bishops issued the call for the special session, it was for the commission or for the Council of Bishops to share the report from the commission on the way forward. And in that call, there was some question as to whether or not other people or other groups would be allowed to submit petitions. And in the Book of Discipline, it says that other petitions that are in harmony with the call would be in order for the General Conference. The Council of Bishops asked the Judicial Council for a declaratory decision about what would be in harmony with the report and what would allow other petitions to come forward. That went before the Judicial Council, and as you know, other petitions that are in harmony with the call are allowed to come forward, and we will see some of those at General Conference. But what happened in the Judicial Council decision was there was a footnote 6 in the Judicial Council decision. And that footnote 6 alerted us that the Judicial Council, in looking back over the history of General Conferences, the Council of Bishops has never been allowed to speak or give a report to the General Conference. And so footnote 6 raised the issue and kind of alerted the Council of Bishops that the call to the General Session needed to be changed, and that the call to the General Session needed to be worded that the Commission on the way forward would bring their report and not the Council of Bishops. Okay? You following me? So, wanting the whole process not to be thrown out and declared, unconstitutional, the bishops issued a new call which for the General Session, which called for the Commission on the way forward to bring its report in collaboration with the Council of Bishops. What that did was change the format of the report. The Commission on the way forward never took any votes. They never took any votes. They worked on each plan and put it through a conciliar process, which literally was a process where you have a pencil in one hand, an eraser in another, and they talked about the different perspectives and the different issues and the different passions. And as we talked and shared stories along the way, each one of the plans got tweaked and changed. In the end, what the Commission's original plan was to the Council of Bishops, it did not include a traditionalist plan. The reason you have a traditionalist plan is because the Council of Bishops, in its recommendation for the One Church plan, asked the Commission to go back and include a traditionalist plan. The Commission had only worked on a traditionalist sketch and did not put that in plan format because it did not meet the vision, mission, and scope that had been given to the work of the Commission. So when the Judicial Council kind of shifted some things on us, the Commission was then in the position where it had to put its report forward. It did not have a recommendation, so it needed to put all of its work forward. The Commission received the request from the Council of Bishops to work on the traditionalist plan again. The Commission said back to the Council of Bishops, we cannot do a traditionalist plan in the same way that we've done these other plans in 2 days. We can't do it because the conciliar process has been a process for 18 months working on this. And so when you look at the report that's going forward, which is a report of the Commission on the way forward, done in collaboration with the Council of Bishops, it does include a traditionalist plan, but that traditionalist plan is not the work of the Commission. It was the work of a few bishops who got together to make sure that there was a traditionalist plan that got into the report itself. So that's how we got to the amended call. It did change how the report gets presented to the General Conference 2016. If we had stayed with the original, what everybody thought we were working with, and the Council of Bishops was bringing the report of the commission on the way forward, then what would have gone forward was a recommendation to the 2019 special session for the One Church plan. As the report is now, you have all of the plans there. You have the Council of Bishops' recommendations as an appendix to the report. And so that kind of brings us up to where we are now. There has been a second referral to the Judicial Council. The reason for this referral is the Council of Bishops wanted to get all three of the plans in front of the Judicial Council prior to 2019 session. Why? Because we wanted to try, the Council of Bishops wanted to try to help the delegates do their best work. And the Council of Bishops was remembering Tampa, Florida, when Plan B had made it all the way through to the end of the General Conference, and then Judicial Council called it unconstitutional, and all that work was left laying on the floor. So the council, we don't know what the Judicial Council will do with that request, but if you've watched media, there's like something over 400 pages now of brief work that has been done that will be presented to the Judicial Council. And so hopefully we'll hear something from the Judicial Council that will help the delegates do their best work. And that we won't hear from the Judicial Council until sometime later in February. It won't, let me make clear that, October. Let me make it clear that if the Judicial Council says that something is unconstitutional, it will not change the report that's going forward. We can't change the report now. It is the report. But what it does do is alert delegates as to where things might need to be amended or changed to bring it in compliance with our Constitution. So again, it's an effort to help our delegates do their best work on the floor. And also let me, if you didn't realize it, bishops don't get a vote in this. And at General Conference, all bishops do is preside unless they're invited to speak specifically and have permission to do so in some presentation or in some worship leadership. So that's where we are. And Scott and Tom, they are members of the commission and are now going to speak to the report itself.
Thank you, Bishop. Let me start by, I think that what I would want to share with you before we get into conversations about what the plans say is to help people understand a little bit of what it was like to be at the table. I know that there has been a lot of concern on some parts and just curiosity on others about what did the commission actually do. And I said, jokingly as part of the message this morning that I did wonder kind of like how I got here. And the reason why I tell that story that way is because you walk into the room with some people who I've known and some people whose studies I have used over the years and that sort of thing, and you're having these different kinds of conversations with them. And so there is that sense of sort of the enormity of the task in front of you. And that would be the first point I'd want to share, is that one of the things that truly struck me about being a part of this experience and a part of this group was the great sincerity and the great seriousness with which every member of the commission took the charge in front of them. That while we were able to have great times of laughter and fun and fellowship as part of our journey together, the weight of the task was always there. That there was a genuine sense of wanting to not let our family of God down, to not let our Savior down, to not let all of those who maybe feel on the outside and looking into our connection down, but to serve faithfully with this task that we have been given. I think that it was special in the way that our conversations came together because that there was an emphasis on making sure we were a community of faith, and as well as being a group assigned a task, that we were dedicated to making sure that worship was a regular part of our work, that making sure that prayer was a regular part of how we conducted ourselves, making sure that we spent time in reflection and always keeping Christ at the center of what we were doing. That took some intentionality. You know that some folks, when you kind of just get in your work groove and you kind of downshift into this other way of thinking, that sometimes that spiritual side of the work can get ignored. But thankfully, because we had one another, that if the group started heading this way, there was usually a voice or two or three that would always remind us to come back to the fact that this was not about us. And this was not simply a chore to get done or a report to get written, but this was the work of the church. And that was a powerful thing to experience. I also think that the tone we set early on with both reading The Anatomy of Peace and the covenant we formed with one another was really powerful in our work. That one of the things, I'm going to have a moment of transparency here. One of the things that concerned me going to our first meeting was whether or not this was going to be about who's right and who's wrong. That there could have our conversations easily could have degenerated into these two camps, and we had to emerge from the octagon with the answer. And I was really praying and hoping that that was not going to be the experience. Fortunately, it was not. That the idea that we could, in fact, come at this with a heart of peace. The fact that we could, in fact, say this is something bigger than ourselves. The fact that we were clear in that we couldn't get anything done unless we were able to do that for ourselves individually so that the group could function was a powerful thing. And the other point I would make is that from my standpoint, I thought it was a powerful example of what the body of Christ can be. In the sense, as you've already heard Bishop Steiner-Ball explain, that this was a group that was diverse in every way and clearly not like-minded around the task before us, as well as our larger positions on full inclusion of LGBTQ people. And the conscious effort to say, can we stay at the table, which took effort. On some days, it took a lot of effort to say we're going to stay at the table, stay at the room, and continue to press on was, I think, truly one of the exceptional group dynamic experiences I've ever seen. That there was authentic relationship built, even if there was not agreement. That there was clear commitment to mission, even if we did not always agree with the choices of the table. And that was a powerful thing. And so from my standpoint, as my grandmother would say sometimes, that God must be in the room, because I do think that's what was going on. So in terms of those particular reflections about our process, and I think just before we get into models, I'll let Tom share his reflections as well.
There were a couple of things I would add. As both the bishops said and Scott, it was an extremely diverse group, more diverse than I've ever been in, and even having worked for the general church was never that diverse. But the other thing that was very interesting and we found helpful, there were only 4 people appointed because they represented constituents. 2, one from Good News, one from Confessing Movement, and then there were 2 who were on Reconciling Ministries. The rest of us came not representing a constituency. Often in the church, we make sure we have all the constituents. I think that was very, very helpful for the process. It was an enormity of task. As Gil Rendell, who was our consultant, said, we are expected in 18 months to quote unquote fix an issue that has been plaguing the church for 40 years. And it's one where nobody agrees. And nobody really knows what else. And so it was a huge task. It was the weight of the task that was very difficult at times. All of us felt that. There were lots of laughter, but lots of tears. And in talking with several people on the commission, there are 4 of us who, at the end of the commission, took a 3-month renewal leave because we needed to step back and get ready. 3 others took extended vacations simply to step back and get their breath. We also talked several in our groups about, well, I've gone back to my counselor just to help me sort through my feelings. Several said, I am using my spiritual director more than ever. That's just the enormity of the task. We all had assignments, and we did not always volunteer for those assignments. Bishop Steiner Ball said, okay, now we're having a writing team, and Scott was on the writing team. And I think I was sitting next to you, and he just went, no. So the work that you see was the work of different writing teams. And why it took so long is the writing team worked, they came back to the commission, we talked about it, we met in small groups, and then the other thing is that each of us had to go to the next plan. So maybe we were just gung-ho on one plan, but we all had to work on all 3 plans because what they wanted was different sets of eyes. So Scott, you were on the writing, several different writing teams to get us where we are. I was on, one of the teams I was on was that we had encouraged, as you know, throughout the connection for people to write emails. So there were 4 of us that read, I think it was close to 1,000 emails. And we categorized them and summarized them. That was a learning experience. We got very quick to know when a church or a group of people were asked to write because we get almost exactly the same. But there were also, we heard from LGBTQ people, we heard from parents of LGBTQ. We also heard from people who were very strong in their Orthodox understanding. That was really helpful to get a perspective from all over the church. I must admit, I would have thought if I was writing to a commission, I probably would have cleaned up my language and not been hateful. But there were several where we just said the depth of anger and hatred on both sides. The other thing was we met with several outside people, and then seminary professors did 2 colloquies where we were invited to go and listen. So there was that. And then the last thing I would say is that I learned a great deal. Partly being American and partly being at General Conference, there are some myths out there. One of the myths is all the African delegates believe exactly the same. All of the African countries are so that it's dangerous to be LGBTQ, and no one accepts. That, we learned, was not true. It depends what part of Africa you're from. And so we had African delegates who were able to talk about their experience with LGBTQ people in their group. Also, as an American, we lump groups together often. We often lump Europe together. And very quickly, the Europeans said, no, it depends what part of Europe you're from. And then we have the Philippines. And so what we learned was that even across the world, there's not an agreement. The last thing I learned, and I think it was at our first or second meeting, 2 of the LGBTQ people were very open. As conversation occurred, the commission was still learning the lexicon and learning vocabulary. And some of the early comments were not Christ-lifting, but it wasn't intentional. But I remember then someone saying, you keep referring to 2 LGBTQ people. You're assuming there's none other in the room. I am. My learning was, how often when I'm in a group do I talk assuming that no one is there that we're talking about or whatever. So there were a lot of learnings in addition, I think, to the work. And at our very last session, we spent a couple of hours in worship, and everyone said exactly what Scott said and what I've said. I don't know how I got on this commission. At that point, we weren't willing to say, yeah, we would do it again. But we were willing to say, we have seen God's hand in all of this. So those are just a couple of things that I've learned. Oh, the plans. Which one are you going to start with?
Okay, so our next piece is we want to go through relatively quickly an overview of the plans. So I'll start with the One Church plan, and I'm going to speak quickly about some highlights of it. I know that you have this excellent summary that has been prepared for you of it, so I don't want to just read what you already have in front of you, but I would call attention to some major things, which is the One Church plan is built with the idea that it allows diversity of action in the church, okay? So it takes the diverse theological understandings of LGBTQ inclusion and belief and allows them to practice it largely under our existing umbrella as is. It doesn't require much, if any, structural change, okay? So the first thing that the One Church plan would do is that it would take the language forbidding LGBTQ participation out of the discipline. That's the first step. The structure of the denomination does not really change after that has been done. It does not expect any pastor, church, conference, or bishop to act contrary to conviction. It does not expect anyone to act outside of their conscience. that if someone does believe that they can serve with integrity in a particular way, as long as that position is known through a process, then appointment making, et cetera, would take that into account. And so this should grant freedom for folk to serve out of their belief with integrity, and all should be able to live under the United Methodist umbrella in that particular model. Okay?
I'm going to talk for a moment about the connectional conference plan. And the bishop and I were talking, I said, you talk about it, it's the hardest to understand, I think, if you get into the weeds. So one of the things we started with on the commission was how much space is enough space for people to live, and how do you deal with context? So even in our context in Susquehanna Conference, Charlie, as a district superintendent in York, that context is much different than Scranton Wilkes-Barre or any other. So how do you do that in a global connection? So this plan, you have to get away from jurisdictions. It would do away from all 5 of the jurisdictions. And it would change to have 3 what we call connectional conferences. One connectional conference would be the traditional connectional conference. The second would be the Unity Connectional Conference, and the third would be a progressive connectional conference. Again, providing space in those 3 so that the traditional will really take the traditional plan. So if a former jurisdiction would vote to become a traditional connectional conference, then very clear accountability to the discipline, no ordination for LGBTQ, pastors would not be allowed to marry. The unity plan is much like exactly what Scott talked about, that there are choices. In the progressive connectional plan, there is permission, but there is an expectation. So if a jurisdiction, for instance, would decide that they would be part of the progressive connectional conference, then pastors don't have a choice. You will marry all LGBTQ people. All in that connectional conference, every annual conference would ordain LGBTQ persons. Now, this is the most difficult to understand because we have to do away with what we've always thought of as church. But the other thing is that the jurisdiction, the former jurisdiction, would vote. So I'm just going to use the Northeastern jurisdiction. So the Northeastern jurisdiction would vote and make a decision of what the Northeastern jurisdiction, would they be traditional, unity, or progressive? All the other jurisdictions would have to do that, as would the central conferences. Where would they join? So let's just say that the Northeastern jurisdiction would say, we're going to be the traditional connectional plan. Annual conferences then could decide, I don't want to be part of, we as an annual conference don't want to be part of that. We'd rather go to another plan. So an annual conference could vote. So it does away with geographical boundaries. It drills down more because it may be, let me go back and say, it may be that in the Northeastern jurisdiction, we pick the Unity Connectional Plan. The Susquehanna Conference picks the Unity Plan. But there might be 40 churches who say, we cannot in good conscience live in that. So they would then make a decision to unite with another connectional conference. This is also the most difficult plan I think, this is Tom's opinion, not the commission, to get passed. This has constitutional amendments. And you remember we voted on constitutional amendments 2 years ago and had to come back and do it again. So there is some question about how easy this will be. Plus, it raises what happens if you have the Susquehanna Conference joining another connectional conference that's 1,000 miles away. How's appointments occur? So, does that make sense?
The traditionalist plan, as I said before, the traditionalist plan was pulled together by a small number of bishops after the commission said we don't have time to put it through the same conciliar process. The traditionalist plan really was not in front of the whole council of bishops until actually it was part of the report. So that's just a piece of information to have. What the traditional plan does not leave us like we are now. The traditionalist plan, if you've read through it, it really tightens up the accountability, it tightens up the accountability in a number of different areas. It does require annual conferences to certify that they will follow the discipline. It also asks bishops to certify. Part of that certification process involves how the bishops work in a variety of aspects within their annual conference, including boards of ordained ministry. In this plan, bishops have to certify that they are naming people to the board of ordained ministry that will uphold the discipline. It reaffirms that marriage is between one man and one woman. And so that there are, in this plan, if you violate the discipline, there are certain penalties and process that are laid out for that. In this plan is also an exit strategy in kind of a couple of different ways. They allow Methodist, they allow annual conferences to separate as another, really creating kind of another denomination. It allows any 50 United Methodist churches, if they would want to come together and kind of as a separate Methodist denomination. One of the things that you need to look at in combination with any of these plans, I'll say right now, is the petitions that are coming from Westpath. Annual conferences hold the liability for our pension programs. And our pension programs, the liabilities for those programs extend far into the future. And so in any kind of exit strategy, whether it's for a local congregation or an annual conference, there is a cost that is involved in order to keep the pension plan moving and supporting in the way that we expect it to support. So I encourage you, along with the plans, don't miss reading and examining the Westpath legislation that goes along with this, because there are any kinds of exit strategies do have an effect on the pension Westpath process and the pension program. So, self-governing churches are a part of this. The creation of concordant churches are a possibility in this. So there's a number of different ways that the church could play out under the traditionalist plan. So you would have to, there's pages and pages to do that. So that's kind of the traditional. I think the traditionalist plan, the thing that the misnomer out there is that it just keeps us the same. No, it doesn't. It calls for more judicial process. It creates a situation where we could have a number of independent kinds of churches, and it creates, in some senses, what the Connectional Conference Plan does in a different way.
One thing I forgot to say, the traditional plan and the one church plan for United Methodist agencies like retirement homes, children's home, that doesn't change. But if we vote for the Connectional Conference Plan, every college, every like Wyoming Seminary, all of them will have to decide which connectional conference will they want to join. Now, there's nothing that says they couldn't join all three, but how are they affiliated? And that raises some more. And the other thing is the connectional plan, I forgot to say, doesn't really ultimately take effect until about 2023, I think.
The other plans would be implemented fairly quickly. We want to talk a little bit about the process of General Conference at this point, and what will happen there. General Conference, as you know, is usually 2 weeks, and we have condensed it into 3 days. This is a challenge. It's a challenge for the delegates, a challenge for the design, and it's in St. Louis in February. Talk about a challenge. The first day, as people are gathering the day before, it is a day of prayer, and I would invite you into that time of prayer the day before we gather for the General Conference, and to be in prayer all the way through the General Conference session. We're really, one of the gifts that the Commission has given to the church is that we can work in different ways. We need to work on our mindsets. If we can come to the 2019 and 2020 General Conferences with a different mindset, a mindset that doesn't look at somebody who has a different position and horribilize them or exaggerate their differences. If we can change that kind of mindset with which we come to these general conferences, we'll get a lot farther in our work together. When we can get together and look at somebody and see that that person is the same lover of Christ that I am, they have the same hopes and dreams that I do, they love the church like I do, they believe in the mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ as contained in both the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. I mean, if we can focus on those things and grab a hold of the mindset and come, not exaggerating our differences, but really come as the Church of Jesus Christ, looking to see how we can have the puzzle pieces kind of work together so that together we can paint that picture of the world as God calls us to love one another, we'll be in a much different place, and we'll be able to handle our conversations on the floor much differently. Now, what I'm talking about, folks, is a change in culture. And really, it's a change in culture, not just in the church, but you've noticed our world is sucking us into a mindset that wants to exaggerate our differences and horribilize people that think differently than we do. Church, this is a day and time that we can make a witness for that it can be a different way. But we have got to put on the heart and mind of Christ. And this is the time to have Emmaus eyes and see people as Christ sees people. That doesn't mean we have to agree with them. My gosh, read through the gospel story. Jesus did not agree with people, with the people that Jesus didn't agree with, and still Jesus worked together to accomplish God's mission and God's will in this world. We can do the same because the same power of God that empowers Christ empowers us as the body of Christ in the world today. We can do that. So So, as we think about General Conference, let's think about working on our mindsets. We're still in the process of designing how this is going to happen in 5 days. But what our rules do is we have to follow some rules for General Conference, and we do have to use legislative committees, but we don't have to use legislative committees in the same way that they've been used in the past. So that's kind of up for discussion. I'm going to ask Tom to speak about rules and legislative stuff.
There are a couple of us from the Commission on the Way Forward no, we were not asked, I think we were told, that there is a design team working with General Conference. And so we've met a couple of times, and it's extremely difficult. Not that the people are difficult, but when Bishop Steiner-Ball talked about rules, there are 39 pages of rules on how General Conference is to be. How long we meet, what legislative committees, how petitions are dealt with. And so what we're trying to do as a design team is to say, okay, within the rules, what is it that we absolutely have to do, and be faithful to them, but how do we also free up the rules so that we can work in a new way? One of the things is the way General Conference is always done is that the petitions go to different committees. Well, we're wondering if that really needs to be this way, because if we're looking at the 3 plans, it's not appropriate, it seems to us, to send 4 petitions from one plan to one committee, 4 petitions from one plan to another. How do we do that and do it as a whole? So part of what's going to have to take some time is we have to wait to see what the Judicial Council says. But the other thing we've been, quite frankly, talking openly about at the special design team meeting is how do we speak truth and love when a constituent group, whoever they are, is feeling like it's not going their way. And then they use the rules to stop the process. If you watched General Conference last time, or if you participated, you know we spent literally 5 or 6 days arguing rules. And so what we're praying for and looking at is how do we design a General Conference that will allow conversation before voting, and how do we do that? It's not an easy process, particularly when the Judicial Council doesn't make their decision till the end of October. So, and the other is what will General Conference do with the plans? The other thing I'll just speak to about the process of General Conference is that many people have asked, well, what bishops are going to preside? There is a committee called the Committee of Presiding Officers. They're made up of people who are delegates from across the church. The way we worked before was that we would meet every day at General Conference. They would give us the calendar for tomorrow, and we would decide which bishop would we invite. As we talked, as the committee talked, we know that all of us bring gifts. Some of us have great gifts of a non-anxious presence leading a General Conference as a presiding officer. And there's some whose gifts that just isn't. So how do we do that to make sure that we have the absolute best presiders? But also, how do we make sure that that person sitting in the chair has not been vocal about one position or the other? In other words, how do we choose presiders that will be faithful to the process and non-anxious, putting themselves second. So those are some things that we continue to talk about. We'll meet again the beginning of October, then the beginning of November, to continue the work of developing General Conference. Our greatest concern, I think, is we've only got a few days. And how do we get the work done? And what happens if we come away from General Conference 2019 with no decision?
I'm not sure what to add to the process of the General Conference piece, but I do think one of the things to consider, what I would say, especially for someone not only in pastoral leadership, but someone who is just seeking to be informed about where we are, is to have a sense of all of the work that is coming. I do think that when you heard Tom try to describe the connectional conference model, and then there are other things that we just really have no idea how this might play out, because there are new things being introduced. Some of you may have heard of what's called the Simple Plan as an alternative. That does not come from the commission, but it is going to be introduced as a petition. So part of the challenge will be for delegates is to simply keep, using the old descriptor, is keep their eye on the ball in this one. That we do have to maintain our focus on what our charge is, what our challenge is, so that we can get to where Christ is leading us. That it will take a process, that's clear, but to not let process get in the way of function, which it can sometimes do, and to maintain the idea of our true focus. So by way of offering a couple of final comments, I would say this. I think the main thing that what I would hope you hear about the commission is, one, to remember what the commission was asked to do. That what I have told a variety of audiences is I believe with 100% of my heart that the commission was faithful to the charge it was given. That we were charged to look at new ways of being church together. And I think the idea of personal positions and individual feelings about LGBTQ people and LGBTQ inclusion in the life of the church is one thing, but the idea of how might we walk together, stay together, was what we were asked to consider and discern in terms of how we felt the Spirit was leading us. And I think we have alternatives that show us different ways to do that. A hard part for anyone, myself included, and I know some of our brothers and sisters on the commission felt this as well, is the challenge in that the new feels different. And so there's in some ways almost a little bit of grief for what I am familiar with, what I gave my life to, what I have invested so much time and energy in is, I won't say dying, but it's definitely changing. And just that reality can be difficult. That sometimes it's that idea that, well, I'm not going to be who I am familiar with or what I'm used to being. But one of the things that I have leaned into when I have some of those moments is often that's part of the triumph of our story. When you say, I'm not who I used to be, and I'm not as good as I'm gonna be, but I know that God has worked a great work in me. And trusting that, when you feel that sense of this thing I love is dying, changing, gonna be different. But remember, in your own life, that even if you're not who you used to be, God has done something amazing in getting you to today. And your tomorrow is even greater. So hopefully we lean into that, no matter how this process plays out.
I want to thank Jason for his presentation, and I want to encourage you not to fear or avoid the conversations in your congregations. Why do I say that? Well, part of the research that was done with the commission was to look at how other denominations handled discussions over LGBTQ inclusion and what worked well and what didn't. To a T, every single denomination and independent church that we talked to about how they handled this issue said that in the congregations where they had conversations prior to any decision, those congregations came through the controversy in pretty healthy shape. Those congregations that did not have conversation prior to any decisions, those are the congregations that denominations usually saw died as a result. I would encourage you to have faith and courage and have the conversations. People don't like to be blindsided or surprised. And you know what? Your congregations have people that believe differently on a whole host of things, and yet they do the mission and work of Christ now. Why couldn't they continue to do that mission and work of Christ in the future? But we got to talk about it. We got to have the conversation. I think we have five or 6 minutes. We're going to come back and do a Q&A this afternoon and come to some of the questions that you submitted. But are there questions now in the last 5 minutes or so before lunch that anybody would like to ask of, I guess, us?
I'll try and say it loud enough. Where can we find the original question that was put to General Conference that created the traditional way forward? I tried to Google it, and I'm probably the best way to do it.
It is part of the verbatim minutes of the General Conference of 2016. And so that can be pulled, but it is in the daily proceedings. The motion was made by George Howard. That was the name of the person who made the motion from the floor of General Conference that ultimately passed. Okay, there were a number of different petitions or motions that were tried from the floor, but it is the motion made by George Howard that created the commission that ultimately passed.
And Bruce, it would be, I think if you Google the DCA that gives the daily proceedings, it would probably be in there. I was trying to recall, I don't know if any who were there remember what day that was. I can tell you the emotion. I just don't remember what day it was, because it was literally palatable, at least at the tables, of what the import would be if we continued with the discussion. So, and if you can't find that, I still have mine. So.
You mentioned that the Connectional Conference plan is the one that is enacted, it'll take till 2023. The other two get enacted, I think the phrase you used was soon after. Any months, days, the next Sunday are we voting? What's the expectation?
Tom is looking through it. I think the one church plan I think it's almost immediate, but usually I think it is. I think for the one church plan, it becomes immediate because there's no constitutional amendments attached to that we are aware of at this point.
It will take, you wouldn't, if that passed, you wouldn't come back and then the next Sunday have a charge conference to say, are we going to allow votes? I would expect, and part of what we've been talking about is what plans as we move forward, not those plans, but what plans does the annual conference need to do? And one would be, how do we help congregations have that discussion? The traditional plan has by 2020 is when the boards of ordained ministry would have to sign the agreement, those kind of things. So both of them are really pretty quick.
It was done by a selected group of bishops who proposed that. Is the assumption that I can make that that's people of one persuasion and not people from across the various points of view?
Yeah, the traditionalist plan was put together with people all of one mind. Yes.
We did work on the traditional plan for a while, a sketch. We did the sketch. And so I think they took some of that, but it was not the work that the commission had done. The other,
I think I see Lou's hand.
Can you'll have general conference in 2019. What will be the relationship of decisions there to general conference 2020? Is the thing that no general conference can hold another church, or are we going to go through it again in 2020?
Lou, that's a very good question. I can only. If you couldn't hear it, it was asked, so we have this 2019, and then we have another general conference in 2020. And you recognize, and this is part of Lou's behind part of Lou's question, in 2019, you have virtually the same delegates as you had in 2016, but in 2020, we're going to have a whole new set, potentially, of delegates. And so what happens can 2020 make a different decision? Do we have to go through all of this again in 2020 that we're going to go through in 2019? And Lou, my understanding is that one general conference cannot bind another general conference. So so some of this conversation may in fact take place again in 2020. I don't know that, the people who are coming to February 2019, if you're coming to this conversation thinking that whatever's going to happen in 2019 is going to solve this conversation for the church, it's not. It's not. There's still going to be conversation. Even though we decide on a plan or a direction, it's not going to solve the conversation. And some of that is because of the positions are very real, and at least some on the very progressive end, see this conversation as a social justice issue. And so they are passionate because they are feeling the call that the church needs to be transformed in some ways. And I would say there's some people on the very traditionalist side that I've had the same argument. The church needs to be transformed in some ways. So if you're coming into this conversation believing that the church needs to be transformed, and a plan that is passed does not speak to the transformation that you believe the church needs to have, then the conversation is going to continue. So, but in the midst of, I say the greatest gift, and this will be probably the greatest gift that the commission has, is that we can hold different positions. We can feel very passionate about Christ and very passionate about the biblical text and interpret it differently, and still get to conversations about the love of Christ and the love of God, and the fact that we are called not to be God's cure givers, but God's caregivers, and that God calls us to reach all people for Christ so that their lives might be transformed in whatever way they need to be transformed. And we can trust God to do whatever transformation needs to take place. But how are people's lives going to be transformed if we can't come together and reach people for Christ in the first place? I mean, we have got to get people in the hands of Christ and then trust that God will bring the transformation that is needed in that person's life, and trust that God will ultimately bring the transformation that is needed in my life.